Subcommittee will come to order. We're meeting today to consider 11 pieces of legislation. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's markup by the Communication and Technology Subcommittee on 11 pieces of legislation. They span a range of important priorities to the members of this committee, including public safety, network resiliency, disaster response, wireless alerting, suicide prevention, media diversity, and the C-band. We're going to start off today with consideration of Mr. Engel's Don't Break Up the T-band Act, which I am a co-sponsor of. This legislation would repeal a requirement of the 2012 Middle Class Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that the FCC sell this spectrum brand. In many communities around the country, including my own, public safety uses this band for essential communication services. Repealing this requirement will ensure that these users are not displaced and that they can continue to use this band to provide critical life-saving services. I understand Ranking Member Walden has an amendment to this bill relating to 911 fee diversion. I support the amendment, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and passage of this legislation. I see a number of our first responders in the audience. I want to welcome you all and thank you for your service. Next up, we'll have Chairman Pallone's Resilient Networks Act. This legislation takes a range of steps to encourage greater pre-planning and coordination amongst telecom providers. It would also encourage greater coordination between energy utilities and telecom providers to ensure that they are working with each other to maintain and restore network connectivity in times of crisis. After that, we'll consider the READY Act from Congressman McNerney, Bilirakis, and Olson. Next will be the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act, introduced by Representatives Moulton and Stewart. This legislation would designate 988 as the National Suicide Hotline and allow states to impose a fee on telecom bills for the support and implementation of this service. Suicide is an epidemic in our country. Nearly 50,000 Americans take their own lives every year, making it a leading cause of death in our country. We need to provide a lifeline to people who are at risk and resources to the call center workers that are tasked with helping those in crisis. After that, we'll consider Representative Matsui and ESHU's Emergency Reporting Act. The next piece of legislation we will consider is the Phone Act from Representative Thompson. This legislation seeks to enable people in areas struck by disasters to keep their phone number if their home has been damaged or destroyed. When you've lost everything and are searching for loved ones in shelter, it seems like the last thing on your mind would be calling your phone provider to make sure you keep your number. This legislation takes important steps to ensure that individuals and communities can get back something of what they lost in these disasters. We will next consider Congresswoman Deming's resolution reaffirming the House's commitment to media diversity and our continued efforts to eliminate barriers to a more inclusive media landscape. After that, we will consider Congressman Butterfield's Expanding Broadband Ownership Opportunities Act, of which I am a co-sponsor. This legislation would reestablish a tax credit at the FCC for the sale of stations that increase or preserve the ownership of broadcast stations by socially disadvantaged individuals. While I believe that much needs to be done to address our nation's shortfalls, I commend my good friend for his hard work and diligence on this issue. After that, we will consider Congressman Vesey and Long's Media Diversity Act. We will then consider Congresswoman Clark's Enhancing Broadcaster Diversity Data Act. This bill will require the FCC to complete its rulemaking regarding the collection of equal opportunity information regarding the workforce and ownership of broadcast stations and cable systems. The FCC would also be required to report this data to the public. Finally, we will consider the C-band Act, which I introduced with my good friend Doris Matsui, as well as Congressman Johnson and Gianforte. We are still working on this legislation, and I want to say that I appreciate the support of our co-sponsors, as well as the continued cooperation and effort from Ranking Member Walden, Ranking Member Latta, and the minority staff. The C-band represents what will likely be our last best opportunity for Congress and this committee to fund essential priorities that we have discussed as long as I have been on this committee, namely rural broadband deployment, closing the digital divide, and enhancing our nation's public safety communications system. While I believe it's essential that we move to make mid-band spectrum available for 5G, we need to ensure that this auction benefits all Americans. I want to thank our colleagues on the other side of the aisle and their staffs for the work that they've done to get these bills to this point, and I hope we can continue to work together on this legislation as we move forward to full committee. I support the legislation before the subcommittee today, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to yield to our ranking member, Mr. Latta, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding today's markup. Greatly appreciate it. And good morning, and welcome to the subcommittee markup on legislation aimed to improve public safety communications and promote diversity in the media marketplace. While we appreciate the majority's interest in these important topics, I would like to begin by noting that some of the bills before the subcommittee today are not quite ready for bipartisan support. The process leading up to this markup has been disappointing. Many of the bills we are voting on today could have had bipartisan support had they been examined through regular order. Unfortunately, it appears that we will be frantically negotiating between the subcommittee and the full committee markup to cobble together legislation that earned bipartisan support. These are important topics and ones that members should be able to familiarize themselves with before having to cast a vote. This is certainly not a time to be negotiating by least common denominator. Rather, we should be building genuine understanding and support for good public policy. But while not all the legislation under consideration today is bipartisan, there are several proposals that we believe represent a good step forward. One of the bills that has received bipartisan support is H.R. 4194, the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act. Designating the 988 dialing code will provide Americans with an easy-to-remember number when they are most vulnerable. This action by Congress provides a critical tool to help prevent suicide across the country and we must make sure that it is done right. We will also be considering the Bipartisan READY Act, introduced by my friend, the gentleman from California's 9th District. This legislation will improve the wireless and emergency alerting system to provide guidance and clarity to the state and local government officials that use wireless emergency alerts in times of emergencies. The gentlelady from California's 6th District, H.R. 5918, the Emergency Reporting Act, would also improve how the federal government responds during times of emergency. This bill would require the FCC to evaluate ways to improve responses to natural disasters by improving network outage reporting and ensure that those outages are reported to 911 centers. On the media diversity front, the subcommittee is considering the gentleman from Missouri's Media Diversity Act. This bipartisan legislation will require the FCC to study in its annual communications marketplace report barriers to entry for women and minorities. It is a timely bill with International Women's Day being celebrated around the world this past Sunday. There are many other bills before us today that I will touch on in more detail as they are called up. I look forward to continuing to work with the chairman on these proposals as they move through the process. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. Today we're marking up legislation that will make Americans safer, media more reflective of our nation's diverse views, and hopefully increase access to broadband and 911 services for urban and rural areas. Improving public safety in the communications sector requires reliable and resilient networks. These networks are critical to ensuring that people can reach out for help during times of emergency. They're also critical to first responders who need to be able to communicate with each other. Hurricanes, wildfires, and tornadoes are inevitable, and despite the best efforts of communication providers, networks will go down, and therefore we must be prepared. H.R. 5926, the Resilient Network Act, which I introduced with Representative McNerney, would minimize disruptions to networks, public safety, and the customers that rely upon them when outages do occur. It would require more pre-planning and coordination amongst communication providers to enable customers of one provider to use the network of another provider during an emergency if their network goes down. It also would increase information sharing between providers and first responders so 911 call centers would be able to identify areas unable to call for help and proactively work with first responders to aid people at risk. We've been having bipartisan discussions on this bill since January, and while we haven't yet reached bipartisan agreement, I look forward to continuing the ongoing conversations as we move to full committee. And after a disaster is over, it's also important to learn from them, and H.R. 5918, introduced by Representative Matsui, would do exactly that. It requires the FCC to issue a report recommending how to improve the resiliency of networks each time the FCC activates the disaster information reporting system. We're also improving alerts for consumers in times of emergency with the READY Act. Representative Mike Thompson's Phone Act will ensure Americans who have lost everything in a fire, tornado, or other disaster won't also lose their phone number. Providers would be prohibited from reassigning phone numbers following certain disasters so that families are able to focus on loved ones and rebuilding and not their phone company. This is obviously the right thing to do, and I hope this bill will garner bipartisan support. Now, communications amongst first responders is also critical to public safety, so I commend Representative Engel for his leadership on this issue and look forward to advancing his bill to preserve the T-band for public safety as supported by law enforcement and the FCC. And I'm pleased that Ranking Member Walden has an amendment to this legislation, and if it's adopted, will overcome his concerns about this repeal. We're also marking up legislation to promote media diversity. If the people making decisions about the content we see and hear do not have a diversity of perspectives, the news, storytelling, and entertainment we see will not represent the incredible melting pot of our great nation. Representative Butterfield's Expanding Broadcast Ownership Opportunities Act would bring back the successful tax certificate program to promote minority and female ownership, which is sorely lacking. We'll also consider Representative Clark's bill that would require the FCC to finally collect diversity data it should have been gathering for years. And finally, we're taking up H.R. 4855, the C-band Act, sponsored by Chairman Doyle, along with Representatives Matsui, Johnson, and Gianforte. C-band spectrum is essentially mid-band spectrum that can be used to speed up our efforts to implement new wireless technologies like 5G. And the FCC is moving forward to auction this spectrum based on a stretching of existing law that's highly suspect. It's incumbent on Congress to provide legal certainty that will speed deployment of 5G and direct the spending of auction proceeds to important bipartisan priorities like broadband deployment and adoption and next-generation 911. The bill we're moving forward today is just a placeholder so that we can continue our bipartisan negotiations to produce legislation that does just that. And I hope we can find a bipartisan solution. But one way or another, Congress has to ensure the American people benefit from the public airways and not just foreign satellite operators. There are several other important bills we are considering today, such as a bill that would establish 988 as the universal dialing code for the suicide hotline with the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act. So I thank everybody for working to get these bills to this markup. I think we're obviously going to have to continue our discussions and hope that we can advance all these bills out of committee on a bipartisan basis once we get to full committee. Thank you, Chairman Doyle. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. Chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for bringing all these bills before us, and especially nearly a dozen pieces of legislation seek to promote media diversity, enhance public safety communications. While I intend to support a number of these measures today, as you know, I would like to begin with the ones I cannot support, starting with H.R. 5926, the Resilient Networks Act. And Mr. Chairman, it's unfortunate because I believe with the right approach, more time, we could find a bipartisan consensus on how to address these challenges that are facing our country. But before we can support such really important legislation, members and the public need to fully understand the approach taken under this legislation to restore communications networks during emergencies. The scope of what it entails, the impact it could have on the public are both important for us to have a better understanding. And as a matter of fact, we've not been able to get at these answers in the short period of time since this bill was introduced less than a month ago. Now, we can sit up here and bicker about process, or we can simply work together to do this right. This is not, on our part, a stalling tactic at all. It's a sincere commitment, as it has been from the start. We should hear from the agencies before placing new burdens on them and expanding their jurisdiction. We should have a hearing with a full complement of witnesses who can share more than a partial picture of the facts on the ground. We should take stock of the Commission's ongoing efforts that were just adopted less than a month ago. These are common sense steps that you held us to when we were in the majority, Mr. Chairman, and we're simply trying to apply the same standard, especially on something that's so important and where I believe we can find common ground. But on a brighter note, There is legislation on today's markup that we are prepared to support with some bipartisan amendments to improve the underlying legislation. We're hopeful to support H.R. 3957. That's Mr. Butterfield's Expanding Broadcast Ownership Opportunities Act, which would reinstate the tax certificate program that benefits both established broadcasters and minorities who are seeking to enter the broadcast ownership business. Unlike the Resilient Networks Act, we know precisely what challenges we face in the broadcast industry to promoting diversity and ownership, the lack of access to capital, and a strong foundation of operations and management experience. While the tax certificate has proven successful in the past, we must also ensure the new owners have a strong foundation to manage the complexities of owning a broadcast station. H.R. 3957, as introduced, would have established a program to create an incentive for radio and television stations to mentor new entrants in the field. And I look forward to speaking more on that in a bit. Unfortunately, the manager's amendment will strike this important provision. I have an amendment that would not only place the mentorship back in H.R. 3957, but also would provide guidelines for the FCC as to how the program should be structured. I'm glad we're moving forward swiftly in considering H.R. 4194, the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act, which designates 988 as the Universal Mental Health Crisis Hotline. Having an easy-to-remember number during a time of personal crisis is crucial so Americans can get the help they need most. This is such an important issue that must be done right, and I look forward to working with all the parties involved to make that happen. We have many other important bills on today's markup, and I look forward to discussing those as well as you call them up. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Walden. We look forward to working with you as we move towards full committee. Are there any other members that seek recognition to make an opening statement? Chair recognizes Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman for having this markup.
For 3 minutes, Jerry.
All right, I'll do under that, Mr. Chairman. In recent years, we've seen devastating wildfires in my home state of California, including the Tubbs Fire, the Camp Fire, which was the deadliest fire our nation has faced in the last century, and most recently, the Kincaid Fire. These events show that we must do more to help people stay connected during wildfires and other natural disasters. They've demonstrated that we need to improve the reliability of the wireless emergency alerts. That's why I've introduced H.R. 6096, the READY Act, with my colleagues on this committee, Mr. Bill Rickus and Mr. Olson. This legislation would ensure that we have a robust and reliable wireless emergency alerting system. The wildfires also made clear that before, during, and after these devastating events, we need to improve coordination between communication service providers and public safety officials on the ground, as well as between communication service providers and utilities. Additionally, the most recent wildfire season demonstrated the need for having adequate backup power in cases of cell tower outages. For these reasons, I've introduced H.R. 5926, the Resilient Network Act, with Chairman Pallone. I'm certainly willing to work with Mr. Walden to improve this legislation, an offer that's been made numerous times before. I'm pleased that we will be considering these two bills during today's subcommittee markup. I'm also glad that we'll be considering H.R. 1289, Mr. Thompson's Phone Act, and H.R. 5564, Ms. Masui's Emergency Reporting Act. Together, these four bills will be vital for helping Californians and Americans to be better prepared for staying connected during and after natural disasters, including wildfires. I thank the chair for holding today's markup, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McNerney. Are there any members on the Republican side that seek recognition? Okay, how about back on the Democratic side? Any other members that seek recognition? Okay, seeing none, at this time we'll begin bill consideration. The chair calls up H.R. 451, the Don't Break Up the T-Band Act of 2019. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 451, a bill to repeal the section of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012 that requires the Federal Communications Commission
Without objection, the
reallocate
first
and
reading of the bill will be
auction
dispensed
the
with.
T-band
The
spectrum.
bill is now considered as read.
Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking
Mr.
recognition?
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman has an amendment at the desk. What is your amendment labeled?
Best amendment of the day.
Okay, I see the clerk has the best amendment of the day.
Yes, sir.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 451, offered by Mr. Walden of Oregon. Add at the end of the following, Section 3.
Mr. Chairman, I move the clerk suspend.
Without
reading of the
objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this amendment would add the text of my First Responder Act to the repeal of the T-band spectrum auction mandate, creating strong safeguards to help prevent 911 fee diversion. Currently, states charge Americans a fee to support 911 services, yet some of these states do not use the money collected from this fee to support 911 services. Rather, they use it for other state priorities that are not related to their providing critical 911 services needed to receive a 911 call or to dispatch first responders in an emergency. Those states are currently classified by the FCC as 911 fee diverters. While those cases are clear and obvious, some states use these fees for things that fall into a more of a gray area. So to reduce ambiguity, the bill directs the FCC to implement rules to clarify what obligations or expenditures are acceptable. These rules would be crafted with input from states to ensure that appropriate 911 uses are included. Additionally, if a state has expenditures that do not fit squarely within the eligible uses determined by the Commission but can provide documentation and receipts to show how these expenditures support PSAP functions and operations or the ability to dispatch emergency responders, then the states should have the opportunity to challenge those expenditures. So this amendment sets up a process to allow for just that. For the states that are truly bad actors, I think we can all agree those states should be held accountable for the shameful practice of diverting 911 fees for programs completely unrelated to 911 services. Misleading the public about the use of their fees is unacceptable. And so to that end, this amendment sets up a strike force of state law enforcement officers, public safety officials, and others to consider potential criminal penalties to end fee diversion at the source. This strike force would also require the FCC to share any evidence it obtains suggesting the diversion of 911 fees with the strike force. I want to thank Mr. Engel and the chairman for working with us to add this language to the bill. I think it's really an important issue. It's one I've talked about for a long time. We must continue to follow along on this, and I look forward to bringing this language across the finish line. And dare I say, as I have before, Mr. Chairman, if we were in private business and solicited through the mail payment for something and then used the money for a different purpose, I think they'd call that postal fraud. And that's kind of what's happening here, and it's time for it to stop. Our first responders need these funds for these vital public services. So I appreciate the work on both sides of the aisle, and I urge passage of this amendment.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I want to thank the ranking member for offering his amendment and for his support for the legislation as amended. The legislation before the committee is absolutely essential to so many of our first responders and many of our communities. And once again, we want to thank the first responders that are with us today for your service and for your support of this legislation. Congressman Engel's Don't Break Up the T-Band Act repeals a provision of the 2012 Middle Class Tax Cut and Jobs Relief Act that required the FCC to auction a band used by public safety users, mostly in large metropolitan areas like New York, where Mr. Engel is from, but also from Pittsburgh, which I represent. This auction is currently mandated to happen in 2021. The cost of relocating public safety users in Pittsburgh alone off the T-band would exceed $250 million, and we're one of the smallest cities that use the T-band. Imagine what that cost is in New York and some other major cities. We need to ensure that our first responders have the communications capabilities they need to respond in times of crisis. GAO has also reported that a sale of the T-band would not even raise sufficient revenue to offset the cost of relocating incumbent users. More than that, first responders do not have access to comparable spectrum resources to relocate their existing services. So, given this reality, it's essential that we repeal this mandate. I've also been happy to see that Chairman Pai also supports repeal. It's a rare day that he and I agree on anything, so this is a good day. Repealing this mandate will ensure that public safety users are not kicked off this important ban and continue to focus on the job at hand, protecting and serving our communities and our country. I'm very pleased that Ranking Member Walden is supporting this important legislation, and we will accept his amendment. I understand that it addresses 911 fee diversion, an issue that he cares deeply about, and I think we can all agree that fees collected for 911 service should go towards supporting and enhancing that service. I believe that the amendment we are adopting will allow us to take significant steps in that direction. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and the underlying bill. At this time, the chair is looking if there's any other members seeking recognition. Chair recognizes, I'm sorry? Oh, is there any Republicans seeking recognition? Okay, chair recognizes Ms. Eshoo for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this markup and for all of the bills that so many members have worked so hard on. On this particular issue, I think I don't often talk about the FCC in these days in positive terms, but on a bipartisan basis, the FCC has really pushed hard on this with the states, and I do want to acknowledge that. And the number of states that are not deferring fees has come down considerably. I think there are just 5 left, and when we started working on this, it was double digit. I believe the former chairman of the full committee, myself, sent a letter out to all the states. So this has been a long, winding road, but our PSAPs, our first responders, these monies need to go directly to them for all the obvious reasons. So we thank them for their advocacy. Mr. Walden, thank you for the best amendment ever, or the most famous, or whatever it is.
Well, just today.
Just today, okay. Well, I'll go for that. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Does anyone on the Republican side seek to strike the last word? Any other members on the Democratic side? Okay. Seeing if there's no further debate, we're going to proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed? In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 451 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 451 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. Okay, the chair now calls up H.R. 5926, the Resilient Networks Act. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5926, a bill to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to provide...
Without objection, first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to offer a bipartisan amendment? Are there any other members seeking to offer an amendment? Is there anyone that wishes to strike the last word on the Republican side? Or Mr. Pallone? You're recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that the subcommittee is marking up the Resilient Networks Act, which, as I mentioned, was introduced with Representative McNerney. With each passing year, we're seeing the increasingly devastating effects of climate change play out in our communities. Hurricanes and wildfires are getting stronger and more severe and are happening more frequently. And these disasters have put our critical infrastructure to the test, and we're learning new and important lessons about where vulnerabilities exist. Having access to networks is essential during disasters, and we saw it firsthand in my district when Superstorm Sandy hit a few years ago. It's critical that when some of our networks go down, our constituents are still able to contact loved ones or call 911 and receive emergency alerts. We have a responsibility to ensure our communications networks are prepared for the worst when disasters strike. That means ensuring communications providers have reasonable backup power solutions integrated into their networks to keep them up and running. But even that is not a guarantee. We know from previous disasters that some provider networks may stay up and running while other networks are out. No matter who your provider is, if one network goes down, a pre-planned agreement between providers can transition subscribers onto a working network, which can be the difference between life and death. So the Resilient Networks Act addresses both of these issues. Information about network outages is also immensely helpful for emergency response efforts, and that's why this bill instructs the FCC to improve how providers submit network information and make the information readily accessible to public safety answering points. The FCC is also required to create a nationwide master point of contact directory with up-to-date information so that communications providers, tower owners and operators, public safety answering points, public safety entities, and utilities are able to communicate and better coordinate response and restoration efforts. And better communications may also reduce the accidental cuts to communication networks that often happen in the recovery phase when companies are working quickly. The bill is future-looking. As wireless providers continue their work to transition their networks to 5G, it's important to understand how 5G networks will operate from a resiliency standpoint. If there are particular strengths or weaknesses in 5G networks when it comes to resiliency in storms or disasters, the FCC should analyze them and consider taking action based on their findings. And finally, the federal government's response to the 2017 hurricane season in Puerto Rico was unacceptable across the board. Our bill requires the GAO to audit the FCC's response to the 2017 hurricane season in Puerto Rico so we can better understand the flaws in their action or perhaps the FCC's inaction. And this is important given the previous requests for an audit of this issue. They were folded into larger reports and therefore no specific review of the FCC's response is being conducted. And there are important lessons to be learned from these events, and I look forward to getting answers from the GAO. And I thank Ranking Member Walden and his staff for working with us through the drafting process. I believe Mr. Walden shares our goals, and I look forward to continuing our conversations on the way to full committee. Since we first introduced this bill, we've worked with stakeholders to flesh out a number of improvements. We are, however, not offering those improvements as amendments today. As Ranking Member Walden and I agreed, we're going to work together on a way to full committee to try and reach a bipartisan solution. And while we've collected written comments from stakeholders and affected agencies through the process, from what we've undergone so far, we also plan to have more in-person conversations with stakeholders and agencies so we can just get this right. And again, Mr. Chairman, strengthening communication networks so they operate during and after a disaster is a vitally important concern, and this bill makes those networks stronger, in my opinion, and the public safer. So I would urge support for the bill and yield back.
I thank the gentleman who seeks recognition. Mr.
Chairman,
Walden.
Move strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would concur with my friend from New Jersey and from Pennsylvania. Making sure our networks are resilient is really important. We share that goal. There's no doubt about it. I've been through a lot of disasters in my home state and when I was in the radio business, worked with first responders, helped in emergency communications. I'm a ham radio operator occasionally. And this is really important, but it's also important to really get it right. It's complicated. There's a lot involved, and I think we'd be in a better place today, I dare say, if we'd use regular order and had really focused on this bill and had its own hearing on this bill, not with 7 others. There's a lot to this. We got to get it right so that we'll have resilient networks when we need them, and that they will work. And so I like roundtables. I set up task forces. I did all that sort of stuff. But I was always reminded that that's not the regular order how the committee operates, and that's true. And so we always tried to work through hearings. And so I hope that between now and full, we can dive deeper and get the answers that I think we all seek. We need to make sure that these networks will work and that what we're requiring doesn't trample existing state regulation and law or jurisdiction, and will actually work. So I just thank the chairman for working with me. We look forward to working together on this, but we're not there yet. So with that, I'd yield back.
Thank the gentleman Who seeks recognition on the Democratic side? For what reason do you seek recognition, Mr. McMurney?
I move to strike through the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. I introduced the Resilient Act 5926 with Chairman Pallone recently. This legislation would make critical improvements to the reliability of our communication networks. During the wildfires this past fall, there were hundreds of cell towers went down when the power was turned off. In Contra Costa County, which is part of my district, 88 towers went down when the power was turned off. This meant that people couldn't dial 911, they couldn't let loved ones know that they were safe, or receive wireless emergency alerts. This is unacceptable. It's imperative that we improve coordination between communications service providers and public safety officials on the ground, and that we improve coordination between communication service providers and the utilities. Additionally, we must ensure that adequate backup power is in place for communication services to stay online during natural disasters, including wildfires. That's why we must pass H.R. 5926, the Resilient Network Act. I thank Chairman Pallone for working with me on this bill. I look forward to working with the ranking member of the committee, and I strongly urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone on the Republican side seek recognition? Anyone on the Democratic side seek recognition? Seeing no one asking for recognition and there are no further amendments, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 5926 to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 5926 will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. The ayes have it, and the H.R. 5926 is forwarded to the full committee. Chair now calls up H.R. 6096, the READY Act. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 6096, a bill to improve oversight by the Federal Communications Commission of the wireless and
Without objection,
broadcast
first reading of the bill will
alerts.
be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to offer an amendment? Seeing none, or is there any members just seeking recognition to strike the last word?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I ask to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect to my ranking member, this is the best bill of this entire markup. I said the best bill, not amendment. I said the best bill. I have to thank my colleagues, Reps. McNerney, Bill Rackus, and Gabbard, for working with me on this critical matter. As y'all are aware, Texas 22 is just south of Houston, Texas. And that means we live in the Gulf of Mexico's Hurricane Alley. It's not when a hurricane will hit, it's not if it'll hit, it's when it will hit. Providing timely information to the public is essential to stopping loss of life during a disaster. The READY Act, H.R. 6069, would do just that. It would get needed information from FEMA direct to the public by sending it to their wireless devices. This bill does more than that, though. Today's smartphones, laptops, computers, and tablets are part of our daily lives. In fact, last week, my wife and I reached our limit with landlines and robocalls. We had a small group of friends over. At least 4 times during 2 hours, robocalls came from Cut and Shoot, Texas, or Ding Dong, Texas, or Jot 'em Down, Texas. And yes, these are real names in my home state of Texas. Also, No Trees, Texas. We are so incensed, all 4 landlines are out in our garage now, and they'll be there forever. We are only going to use cell phones for communications with the world. And that's why this bill asks the FCC to review the potential of having emergency alerts via the internet and mobile phones, mobile devices. They say knowledge is power. In emergency situations, knowledge can be the difference between life and death. We have the technology to get information to the public during emergencies faster than ever before. It's time we put it to work on behalf of the American people. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any members seeking recognition? Mr. McNerney, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word on H.R. 6096.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. The wireless emergency alerting system and emergency alerting system provide life-saving tools to disseminate information during times of emergency. We've heard firsthand from Anthony Gossner, the fire chief for the city of Santa Rosa, who testified before our subcommittee last week about the importance of these alerts. It's critical that these alerting systems are both robust and reliable. That's why I've introduced H.R. 6096, the Ready Act, with my colleagues on the committee, Mr. Olson and Mr. Bill Rickus. This important legislation will improve the current wireless emergency alerting system and emergency alerting more broadly so that my constituents and Americans across the country can count on receiving these alerts when faced with dire situations, including wildfires. Again, I want to thank my colleagues, Mr. Olson and Mr. Bill Rickus, for working with me on this legislation, and I strongly urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any members on the Republican side seeking recognition? Are there any members on the Democratic side seeking recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition from Florida?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Just briefly, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about how important both the Ready Act and the Resilient Act that we just voted on are for my home state, the Sunshine State of Florida. We, like Texas, unfortunately are predisposed to getting hurricanes over time. My own district got hit by Hurricane Irma. We just missed getting hit by Hurricane Dorian, and we also got hit by Hurricane Michael. And one of the things that struck me as we got hit by Hurricane Michael, which turned from a Category 1 to a Category 5 within one day, was I reached out to one of my colleagues, Dr. Dunn of the Big Bend area, to text him to see if we could all work together to help his office out. He got that text 3 months later. It shows how critical some of these cell phone agreements are and roaming agreements are, and working with the FCC and FEMA, because cell phones are fundamental. We saw it again in Puerto Rico, my family's native home, with Hurricane Maria, where folks were using satellite phones that barely worked, could not get their cell phone service together in time to be able to access internet and to be able to fill out FEMA forms. So this is an important partnership between the FCC, the Congress, major cell phone providers, and others, because this is the way going forward that we're going to be communicating more and more. So I applaud the proponents of this bill and look forward to working together on these great bipartisan proposals, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any member of the Republican side seek recognition? Are there any members on the Democratic side seeking recognition? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 6096 to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 6096 to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 6096 is forwarded to the full committee. Chair now calls up H.R. 4194, the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act of 2019. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4194, a bill to amend the Communications Act of 1934, to direct the Federal Communications Commission to
Without
designate
objection,
9,
first reading of the
8,
bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The chair now recognizes Mr. O'Halloran to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does the clerk have the amendment?
Yes, sir.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4194, offered by Mr. O'Halloran.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. Halloran, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
And I thank the chairman. Last Congress, I was pleased that the committee reported the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act. That bill instructed the FCC to study and consider whether it was technically feasible to establish a 3-digit number as the dialing code for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Today, we are considering legislation that expands on that effort, now directing the FCC to designate 988 as the number to call to access the lifeline. The current National Suicide Prevention Line, 1-800-273-TALK, received 2.5 million calls in 2018. The Lifeline's effectiveness is proven, de-escalating close to 98% of interactions with people who call experiencing suicidal crisis. A more accessible dialing code that is easier to remember is likely to save more lives than it does today. The bill will also ensure that Lifeline Network call centers have the resources necessary to handle the increase in volume that they are anticipating. Beyond assisting call centers, the bill will also relieve much of the cost burdens associated with traditional police and emergency medical response. Across the United States, people are dying by suicide at alarming rates. The numbers are especially problematic for young people in particular. The amendment I'm offering generally brings the bill in alignment with legislation that has been reported out of the Senate Commerce Committee. This amendment adds an additional requirement for the Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use to submit a report with a strategy about how to offer support or provide technical programs to increase competitively in this serving youth in crisis. I understand there are still some concerns regarding how a new number will be implemented nationally by providers and crisis centers, given that this bill only requires that the new number be designated. The FCC is currently reviewing this issue and has a notice of proposed rulemaking asking questions about how it should implement the designation 988. In my view, while the FCC examines these questions, we must do all that we can in Congress to make 988 accessible to every American in suicidal crisis as soon as possible and without delay. This bipartisan bill will save lives, and I think represents the Representative Stewart, Moulton, and Johnson for their work on the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act. I urge all members to support the amendment in the nature of a substitute and the underlying bill as we move forward.
Are there other members seeking to speak on the amendment in the nature of substitute? Mr. Gianforte,
Yeah, I move to strike the last word.
you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Alata, for including H.R. 4194, the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act of 2019, in today's markup. This is a critical piece of legislation. I thank the gentleman on the, Mr. O'Halloran, for his leadership on this. We need to help Americans facing this crisis. Our nation faces an epidemic of suicide, and Montanans are tragically all too familiar with it. Montana has the highest suicide rate in the country, with 164,000 Montanans with some form of mental illness. Unfortunately, mental health care is not available to many Montanans. In fact, more than 600,000 Montanans live in an area where there is a shortage of mental health professionals. Ideally, everyone would have access to preventative mental health care. Folks who live in rural and frontier communities face overwhelming obstacles to receive mental health care. That's why 988 is so important. Our amendment will bring the language of this bill in line with our colleagues in the Senate, making swift passage possible. I thank you again for the opportunity to discuss this important piece of legislation and look forward to seeing the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act signed into law. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Are there any members on the Democratic side seeking recognition? Mr. Latta, for what Purpose do you seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word.
You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, I support the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona and the gentleman from Montana. H.R. 4194 is amended would task the Federal Communications Commission to designate a 3-digit code for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. In January, I saw firsthand how this designation would make it easier for Northwest Ohioans to seek help in their most vulnerable time of need. FCC Chairman Pai and I visited the Rescue Mental Health and Addiction Services, a National Suicide Prevention Lifeline Center crisis center in Toledo, Ohio. At the center, we learned that the number of hotline calls that needed answering in Ohio increased by 70% from 2016 to 2018. With suicide rates growing in nearly every state, the need for prevention services has never been greater. That is why I am supportive of this amendment. 988 will bring us one step closer to reduce the stigma surrounding mental health conditions, increase help for those at risk of suicide, and save lives. However, before this bill goes to the full committee markup, we need to ensure that its language is clear and that when 988 becomes operational, services will be in place to support the expected influx of calls. Just as we see across most sectors and industries, low unemployment rates have led to a workforce shortage, including in social and mental health services. In 2018, over 13,000 calls made in Ohio were not able to be answered by a call center in the state. This means that due to a shortage of qualified staff, over 13,000 individuals in my home state likely had to wait in long lines to speak to a counselor and were not connected to local care service resources. While I fully support the 988 designation, we need to ensure that Lifeline is operational and able to handle high call volumes within an appropriate timeline so that at-risk Americans can get the help they need. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I see the gentlelady from Michigan seeks recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I support the gentleman's amendment. Suicide is now the 10th leading cause for death in adults age 18 to 64. And for every suicide, there are 25 attempts. Earlier last year, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found that suicide rates increased by 28% between 1999 and 2016. 49 states experienced an increase in suicide rates during that period. We also know that the risk is significantly higher for veterans. Veteran men are at a 19% higher risk, and veteran women are 2.5 times higher risk than non-veteran women. These statistics point to a problem that's all too real and sadly all too common. It's heartbreaking when someone is suffering so much that they choose to end their own life. The bill before us today would make it even easier for people wanting to connect with someone through the hotline and represents a real effort to address suicide prevention. I agree with my friend from Ohio. We have to make sure it works, but we got to work together to try to save lives. I urge my colleagues to support the bill and yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Chairman?
For what purpose does the
Strike the
ranking
last
member?
word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I've got a couple of questions for council that I'd like to ask, just to get clarification on this legislation. So Section 2 of the bill sets a one-year deadline for the designation of the universal telephone number for the National Suicide Prevention and Mental Health Crisis Hotline System. Alongside the bill, the FCC also has proposed rules to designate a national hotline number, and they're presently receiving comments from the public, communications providers, and importantly, the experts on the front lines who will train and staff the hotline. And while we all agree it's critically important to get the service running as soon as possible, I want to know if the bill sets an artificial commencement of service deadline that providers and suicide prevention experts would be mandated to meet. Setting deadlines that all the players can meet is critical to both gaining the public trust that the service is fully functional and protecting the resources of the suicide prevention experts working hard to deliver these services. So my question to council, does the term designate in the bill, that is the designation date, mandate any particular date for hard launching or operationalizing the service, a date which the FCC is currently receiving comment on and considering under its proposed rules?
Congressman, the term designate is not defined in the bill. It therefore would receive its plain and ordinary meaning in the context of the statute. The term designate, according to the New Oxford American Dictionary, means to officially assign a specified status or ascribe a specific name or quality to. Under the bill, however, to your point with regard to operationalization,
Came up.
making it operational, under the bill, the Assistant Secretary and for Mental Health and Substance Use and the Secretary of Veterans Affairs are required to jointly submit a report that details the resources necessary to make the use of 988 as designated under paragraph 4 operational and effective across the United States within 180 days of passage.
Okay, so under the bill, could the FCC require that 988 is operational in the sense that it can be dialed without yet having any services available for consumer use?
Congressman, the bill does not speak to any specific requirement on the Commission to make service providers or to compel service providers to provide any additional services beyond the designation, which is specifically required, as you mentioned, in Section 3.
All right, thank you. That's very helpful. I wholeheartedly believe that this legislation will help millions of Americans who struggle with suicidal thoughts. And it's important that we pass this legislation quickly, but we're dealing with American lives, and we must make sure that we get this legislation right. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I appreciate the counsel of the council, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any members on the Democratic side seeking recognition? Any members on the Republican side? Seeing none, are there any members who seek recognition to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute? Seeing none, if there's no further discussion or amendments, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4194 will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4194 is agreed to. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4192 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor? 4194, not 4192. Forwarding H.R. 4194 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 4194 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 4194 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. Chair now calls up H.R. 5918, a bill to direct the Federal Communication Commission to issue reports after activation of the Disaster Information Reporting System to make improvements to network outage reporting. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5918, a bill to direct the Federal Communications Commission to issue reports after activation
Without
of
objection,
the
first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to offer an amendment? Seeing none, are there any members seeking recognition to speak on the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does Ms. Matsui seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
General Lady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to see this important public safety bill moving forward on a bipartisan basis. The Emergency Reporting Act would require the FCC to standardize its emergency response by conducting field hearings, issuing reports, and making policy recommendations whenever disasters strike. Our current approach of relying on members of Congress to call on the FCC to act is no longer sustainable. We need to set a baseline level of responsiveness to ensure local officials have the support they need to secure our communications network in the face of rapidly changing climate. While we do not have an amendment ready for today's markup, we have an agreement in principle to revise this legislation on the way to full committee markup. I want to thank Mr. Bilirakis for working with me on this important bill. And with that, I yield to Mr. Bilirakis, if he is here.
If the gentlelady would yield, Mr. Bilirakis could not be here.
Certainly. Would you, I yield to you then?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And we just want to say thank you for working with us. You and your team have been terrific, as usual, and we're glad we could find common ground on this legislation. Look forward to moving forward on it. So thanks for your good efforts.
Thank you. And I yield back.
General Lady yields back. Does any member on the Republican side seek recognition to speak on the bill? Any member on the Democratic side? Oh, Chair, Ms. Eshoo, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word,
You're
Mr.
recognized for
Chairman.
5 minutes.
I want to thank my good friend, Congresswoman Matsui, for her leadership on this bill, and I'm proud to have partnered with her on it. The human impacts of these natural disasters are worsened when our communications infrastructure is not resilient. Unfortunately, this is an issue that Californians know all too well. Californians have really been tested, and tested mightily. On October 28th, just a few months ago, 874 cell towers were out in my state, caused by wildfires and power shutoffs. My constituents were worried sick that they wouldn't be able to call 911 during emergencies, receive emergency alerts, or download public safety information. At our February 27th hearing on public safety, I read out messages that I'd received from my constituents who felt vulnerable, afraid, and upset, to say the least. And I share all these emotions with them, and we have to help them. Wildfires are getting more intense because of the change in climate, and PG&E estimates that shutoffs will impact nearly 2 million Californians this year. Without real updates to federal law, our telecom problem will once again worsen the impacts of these disasters. And I think that's what's really important for all the members to understand is the reason that this legislation is so important. If we don't do it, these conditions will add to the bad conditions that we know are going to occur. So obviously I'm proud to support the legislation because it's critically important. I asked Chairman Pai to visit California and hold a field hearing following the fires and the associated power shutoffs in California, and many of my colleagues from California did the same. So I was pleased to read that the FCC received our overall message and did, in fact, is going to hold a California hearing soon. So we need to learn from every disaster, and we're constantly learning. We have to. It's all unfortunate, but we have to learn from it, especially by listening to local safety leaders, to municipalities, to counties, to state officials, and certainly to the communities that have been impacted. So this, I believe this legislation is going to help. So I urge everyone to support it. I think it's well drawn. I think it's going to make a difference. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
General Lady yields back. Mr. Bilirakis, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5
Thank
minutes.
you. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this is an important topic, and I want to thank Representative Matsui and her staff for working with the minority leading up to today's markup. We are prepared to continue working to finalize the details of the amendment to this legislation as we move forward to full committee markup and make this a bipartisan public safety initiative. I appreciate your openness to coming to the table and accept our edits and work with all affected parties to ensure that we make this a bipartisan effort. And I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Gentleman yields back. Any other member of the Democratic side wish to strike the last word? Anybody on the Republican side? Seeing no further discussion, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 5918 to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and H.R. 5918 is passed and forwarded to the full committee. Chair now calls up H.R. 1289, the Preserving Home and Office Numbers in Emergencies Act of 2019. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1289, a bill to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to provide for a...
Without objection, first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Chair will recognize Ms. Eshoo to offer an amendment in the nature of the substitute. What is the amendment labeled?
It's labeled SLW 1074.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1289 offered by Ms. Eshoo.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Ms. Eshoo, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a clarifying amendment to the Phone Act, which I worked on with my great pal, Congressman Mike Thompson, the sponsor of the Phone Act. After the Atlas and Tubbs fires in October 2017, Congressman Thompson's constituents returned to what was left of their homes. Now, I went both to Napa and Solano counties, and to see what was left, in so many situations, there was nothing left, only brick chimneys on properties. They looked like gravestones. It was a horrifying experience to see the aftermath of what had taken place. My colleagues will recall, I think, the moving testimony that the fire chief of Santa Rosa, Anthony Gosner, shared with us just 2 weeks ago, describing the heart-wrenching reality that his community faced after these fires. In the rebuilding process, many of them were frustrated to learn that not only did they lose their homes and all of their possessions, they also lost their phone numbers, which phone companies had given away. So this legislation, with my amendment, aims to fix that problem, and it does it in 3 ways. First, if the president issues a major disaster declaration and a governor designates a disaster area, phone numbers in that designated area cannot be reassigned for 1 year. Second, if someone in the disaster area needs more than a year, they can get a 2-year extension for a total of 3 years. This is important because in some disasters, recovery takes many years. The rebuilding process has taken over 6 years in some areas devastated by Superstorm Sandy. Third, the bill allows consumers who demonstrate that their home is inaccessible or uninhabitable to cancel phone service without a cancellation fee. The bill also prohibits resubscription fees when consumers get phone service somewhere else in the area. So to me, this policy is simple, it's powerful, and it's necessary. I worry that some of my colleagues who may oppose the bill understate the significance of someone's phone number. One of the first things that I remember my parents teaching me was to memorize my home phone number, Walden 95114. I still remember it, and that's a long, long time ago. So our phone numbers really are part of our identity. Now, while many have cut the cord and are opting to live with just cell phones, it's important to consider who depends on landlines. They are older Americans and retirees. They often have multiple doctors, caregivers, and loved ones using long-held phone numbers. So the legal effect and intent of this bill are purposefully narrow, to plug a small gap in the law, but this gap means the world to consumers, and they're our constituents, and that's who it's really written for to protect. It was unimaginable devastation in Congressman Thompson's district that drove him to draft this bill. And there were so many in the community that contacted him. He didn't just make this up out of thin air to write a bill. The leading scientists tell us that we should expect even more frequent and intense disasters, and I hope that doesn't come true for anyone here. But if it does, my sensibilities are that we will have constituents that will contact us on this issue as well. So I think this called the Phone Act is a common sense bill, my colleagues, and I urge you to support the amendment and the underlying bill. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back as their.
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last
The
word.
gentleman's recognized for 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman, and I understand that the amendment in the nature of substitute for H.R. 1289, the Phone Act, would require that phone companies cannot reassign phone numbers of subscribers that have been affected during an emergency, except for at the request of a subscriber during a covered period. And while we're not here to discuss the coronavirus, hypothetically, under this legislation, if the president made a declaration of major disaster under Section 401 of the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act due to the coronavirus, would this bill apply? And that's a question I have for counsel.
Congressman, in order for the protections in this AINS to apply, two things have to happen, as you note. First, the president would have to issue a major disaster declaration. That first requires the governor of a state to request such. Second, under the bill, the governor of that state would have to designate a particular area as being one that, in the public interest, that state believed needed the protections of this act. So both of those things would have to happen.
Now, in my state of Oregon, and I believe Washington, both governors have now declared states of emergency related to the coronavirus. We also had a flood in the same county where they, 2 weeks later, found a person that has now tested positive for coronavirus. So those folks are dealing with both. Now, I'm looking specifically at Section 2, subsection C, 2C on page 5 of the AINS. 2C5. Now that states that the provisions of this bill are applicable in the case of a disaster declaration by the president under the Stafford Act. So the text of the AINS also defines a designated area as a, quote, geographic area for which a state has submitted a public designation to the commission, stipulating the state has determined that the prohibitions described in this paragraph are necessary and in the public interest. So hypothetically, would the definition of a designated area allow a state to determine that these prohibitions are, quote, necessary in the public interest, close quote, due to something like the coronavirus?
Congressman, the bill does not provide any prohibitions on how a state may determine a designated area, except, as you note, that a designated area means a geographic area for which a state has submitted a public designation to the commission stipulating that the state has determined that the prohibitions described in this paragraph are necessary and in the public interest.
So I think what you said, being the non-lawyer that I am, is the answer is no. The president could declare a major disaster, and these provisions would apply. Is that right?
No, Congressman. As I noted before, two things would need to happen.
If the governors did what they did, and the president did what he did.
If the state were to make a finding that an area was designated under this act, as I just described on page 5, and the president determined that we were in a covered period pursuant to the Stafford Act, then the prohibitions would apply.
But that could happen. I'm just hypothetically, or I'm not trying to get way out over our ski tips, but that could have happened with a situation such as the coronavirus.
The bill doesn't limit. It doesn't say, for example, that you may not do this in the event of a coronavirus outbreak or anything like that. So there's no limit in that regard.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I thought, and that's what our councils thought. Mr. Chairman, I know we've talked a lot today about process, regular order, and our concerns that the bill's subcommittees considering today may not have had adequate review. I'd like to point out that our concerns and complaints about process aren't simply something we're just here to complain about. We have a process for a reason. It's designated to ensure questions like these are raised and answered before the subcommittee has to cast a vote on legislation, and so on the way to full. So I think we all want to get to the right place on this bill. I just don't know that we're at the right place yet.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
If you want to ask more questions, or members want to ask questions, they should ask them now, and then we can decide whether we want to pass this. It's really a very simple bill. I know that some of the big telephone companies don't like it, but that's not my concern.
Nor is it mine.
Yeah, okay, good.
That's not the purpose of my question. My question is to make sure that we understand when we set up a system like this what we're applying to. Clearly, in the cases you've identified, my friend from California, there's no disagreement here. Question is this door opened wider than you anticipate or that you support?
If the gentleman would yield again?
Sure.
The governor would have to designate what area this applies to. So that may be helpful to you.
No, I got that. Oh, I realized my time's expired. All right. There you go.
Gentleman's time has expired. Does anyone seek recognition on the, do you want to speak, Anna? No? Anyone seek, Chair Mr. Lotto, for what purpose do you seek
I'm going to
recognition?
strike the last word, Mr.
You're
Chairman.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I stated at our legislative hearing on this bill only 11 short days ago, I think we all can agree that consumers shouldn't lose their phone number after their home is destroyed from a fire or a hurricane. But at the end of the day, we need to properly understand the need for the legislation as well as to understand how the law would be carried out if it were enacted. With that said, I'm hopeful that in agreeing to work together prior to a full committee markup, we can find an answer to both of those questions. We should also learn about the Commission's current process of obtaining a waiver that achieves the goals of the legislation. I will commit to working with you and affected stakeholders to not only better understand the current status on aging phone numbers, but also identify whether there is a path forward to reasonably implement the goals of the Phone Act. This is important yet complex issue that requires due process by the subcommittee, which I do not believe we've gotten to today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone seek recognition on the Democratic side? Seeing none, on the Republican side? Okay, seeing none, are there any members who seek recognition to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing that, if there's no further discussion or amendments, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1289 will signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of the substitute to H.R. 1289 is agreed to. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1289 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 1289 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to, and H.R. 1289 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. Chair now calls up H.Res. 549, reaffirming the commitment to media diversity and pledging to work with media entities and diverse stakeholders to develop common ground solutions to eliminate barriers to media diversity. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.Res. 549, a resolution reaffirming the commitment to media diversity and pledging to work with media.
Without objection, first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to offer an amendment? Seeing none, are there any members seeking recognition to speak on the bill? Seeing none. If there's no further discussion, the chair will now ask for a vote on the bill as written. All those in favor of forwarding H.Res. 549 to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. H.Res. 549 is forwarded to the full committee. Chair now calls up H.R. 3957, the Expanding Broadcast Ownership Opportunities Act of 2019. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3957, A bill to direct the Federal Communications Commission to take certain actions to increase...
Without objection, first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point.
Mr. Chairman.
I will now recognize Mr. Butterfield to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3957, offered by Mr. Butterfield.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. Butterfield, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, for making this happen today. Thank you to the ranking member. Thank you to Mr. Pallone, and certainly to Ranking Member Walden. Thank all of you for supporting and embracing this legislation. Mr. Chairman, the broadcast ownership numbers are clear and somewhat alarming. While women and people of color make up over 50% of our population, broadcast ownership hovers somewhere around 10%. In the past, the FCC's licensing process emphasized licensing criteria such as prior broadcast experience, which often disqualified women and people of color from getting a license. Worse yet, the FCC discriminated against minorities and routinely denied licenses to qualified African Americans. That has been proven time and time again. While the Commission granted its first broadcast license to a woman back in 1922, the FCC did not begin granting radio licenses to applicants of color until 1949. Though the Civil Rights era ushered in more rights for women and people of color, much of the damage from the FCC's licensing process had already been done. To address the lack of ownership by people of color, the FCC created the Minority Ownership Tax Certificate Program. That was the Minority Ownership Tax Certificate Program, and it was enacted back in 1978. The program provided favorable tax consideration to companies that sold a radio or television station to a minority-owned business. It was a good program. During the tax certificates program's tenure, minority broadcast ownership increased. It increased from 40 radio and TV stations back in 1978 to 288 radio and 43 TV stations in 1995. The program was very successful. This bill would reinstate the tax certificate program at the FCC, which would incentivize sales to women and members of minority groups and encourage investment of capital in stations owned by women and members of minority groups. The bill also requires the FCC to make recommendations to Congress for increasing the number of broadcast stations owned by women and members of minority groups and submit to Congress a report every 2 years that discloses the total number of broadcast stations that are owned by women and minority groups. I believe there is widespread agreement among my colleagues that we must do more, and we can do more to bring equity to the media marketplace. The tax certificate has proven to be a successful and effective tool, and I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. I thank Mr. Walden for his opening statement earlier, indicating a willingness to embrace this amendment, and I thank you so very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any member seeking recognition to speak on the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman.
I reserve a point of order.
Well, I got to offer it first.
Yeah, just a second.
Okay.
Do you wish to speak on the amendment
This is
in
the
the nature
world's
of a
second
substitute?
greatest amendment today.
You have an amendment to the
I
amendment.
do, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3957, offered by Mr. Walden.
Mr. Chairman,
Strike Section 5
reserve
and
a point of-
insert the following.
Yeah,
Section
the clerk, without objection, reading the amendment will be dispensed with. Ms. Matsui.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Chair recognizes Mr. Walden for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would establish a robust incubator program for radio and television stations. The incubator program would create an incentive for established broadcasters to mentor new entrants on the operations and management of a broadcast station and to help ensure their operational and financial viability once they're an owner. At our legislative hearing, we heard from witnesses about the challenges associated with new entrants, especially women and minorities gaining access to capital. It was also mentioned at the hearing that many times such parties interested in entering the broadcast industry are not aware of which stations are on the market or what details are available. So that's why I believe that creating an incubator program, along with reinstating the tax certificate program, has the potential to truly promote diversity in the broadcast industry. Having an established broadcaster who has the knowledge and capital to run a broadcast station can help bring women and minorities into the industry by providing mentorship, making introductions, and leveraging their established reputations with creditors. This will also help create opportunities for a more diverse broadcast industry. This should not be a partisan issue. We all share the same goal here. Indeed, Mr. Butterfield's bill already includes a section, Section 5, dedicated to restoring this incubator program. It is in the bill before us today, so I think removing that provision is the wrong direction to go. We're voting on an amendment to do exactly that, unfortunately, in the end. So I'd also note this subcommittee heard testimony directly for this program, and at the legislative hearing held to examine the best ways to promote diversity in the broadcast industry, the witness from the National Association of Broadcasters, Ms. Sutter, testified that, and I quote, "We would encourage this committee to consider adding the incubator program to your consideration of things that can improve diversity in the industry, and we would also ask that you include television." She went on to say that Congress could do something to codify that along with the tax certificate. Those were her words. And so I thought that was a smart inclusion in the gentleman's underlying bill. I'm sorry to see the Ains remove it, and I have an amendment to put it back in. We're happy to work with you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee to ensure that we address concerns before the full committee markup. But I really think this voluntary program is a way to promote diversity in the media marketplace, and I look forward to working with you all on this issue. As you all know, my wife and I were co-equal owners of our radio company. She had 50% of the stock, and I had 50% of the stock. We were in small market radio and worked with a lot of our colleagues, and I just think this incubator program holds great promise to get more women, more diversity, more minorities into ownership. But I also know that it applies to the underlying bill, not the Ains. I respect that. And so it's my intent to having now made this very powerful and important statement to also offer to withdraw the amendment in accordance with our rules. And without objection, I would move to do so.
I thank the gentleman, if I can be recognized very briefly.
Yeah, gentleman withdraws his amendment.
I thank the,
Chair,
I thank the
Mr. Butterfield, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
to strike the last word.
Gentleman will suspend for 1 second. Do you move to strike the last word on the underlying bill?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Chair's you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Sure. I thank you, Mr. Walden, and you know more about broadcast than I will ever know, and I thank you so much for your willingness to work with us and to talk this through. This is an issue that we both care about. As we know, just last September, the Third Circuit struck down the FCC's incubator program because the FCC had failed to consider the effect the incubator program would have on ownership of broadcast media by women and racial minorities. Nothing in this amendment acknowledges this defect, and so I would urge my colleagues to reject the amendment because the sponsor has withdrawn it. I look forward to working with you as we move to the full committee markup. You raised some valid points, and it's worth exploring. Let's find a way to do it, and I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any further amendments? Is there any further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. O'Halloran, for what purpose do you seek recognition? Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. I would like to thank the ranking member, Walden, for his devout work on this important issue and the raising the importance of the broadcast incubator program. Promoting diversity in the media industry is important for the expression of many ideas that reach listeners and viewers everywhere. I believe a tailored incubator can help accomplish this goal. While I understand the gentleman is going to withdraw or has withdrawn his amendment, I hope he can continue to work in a bipartisan fashion to reach consensus on the structure of a robust incubator program for radio and television stations that participate. Thank you, and I yield to Mr. Walden.
And I thank the gentleman, and I really have enjoyed working with him on this. It's an important topic. I want to thank you for your attention to this issue as well. Mr. Chairman, I would hope that given the support from members of both sides of the aisle in the subcommittee, the industry, and the diversity advocates, we can find a path forward here between now and full committee to permanently authorize a broadcast incubator program for both radio and television, especially as we have committed to working with you on all your priorities like the Resilient Networks Act. We would hope we'd be able to do the same thing here as we go forward on this bill as well. And would you be able to assure us of that?
Of course.
I thank you, and I am corrected that apparently my amendment would have been in order because it's written to the underlying bill, not the aims. So crack staff has corrected me on that. So that does make it one of the two best amendments of the day. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I
Yes.
withdraw my reservation.
Gentlelady withdraws her point of order. If there's no further discussion or amendments, seeing none, we will proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3957 will signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3957 is agreed to. Chair now recommends, Chair now asks for a vote on forwarding H.R. 3957 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? H.R. 3957 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. Chair now calls up H.R. 5567, the Media Diversity Act of 2020. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5567, a bill to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to require the Federal Communications
Without
Commission.
objection, first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to offer an amendment? Are there any members seeking recognition to speak on the bill? Wow, okay. If that's the case and there's no amendments and no further discussion, the chair will, the question occurs now on forwarding H.R. 5567 to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. H.R. 5567 is forwarded to the full committee. Chair now calls up H.R. 5564, the Enhancing Broadcaster Diversity Data Act. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5564, a bill to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to provide certain
Without objection,
requirements.
first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Chair will now recognize Ms. Clark to offer an amendment in the nature of the substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5564, offered by Ms. Clark.
Without objection, reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Ms. Clark, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Last May, I, along with Senator Chris Van Hollen, sent a letter to FCC Chairman Ajit Pai, urging the Commission to restart the collection of data on workforce diversity in the media industry. Currently, the FCC is required by law to collect this information, yet has failed to do so. Without this information, the FCC and Congress are unable to identify industry trends and understand how the media industry is faring when it comes to employment diversity. Collecting this information seems to have been held up due to alleged constitutional concerns. However, the FCC in 2004, under Republican Chairman Powell, unanimously concluded that the FCC is, and I quote, directed by statute to require the submission of such reports by broadcast television stations and MVPDs. Furthermore, the FCC has the authority to require employment reports for all broadcasters and MVPDs and would exercise that authority even if not required by statute to do so, unquote. I should I shouldn't have to explain why diversity is so critical in the media industry. Representation matters in the most basic but important respects. The people behind the scenes can influence the programming that we see and hear, and that programming plays a critical role in our democratic process and influencing people's perspectives. This was one of the key conclusions 50 years ago by the Kerner Commission, which found that the media's portrayal of people of color and race relations had intensified social discord. The Kerner Commission stated that the overwhelmingly white media had, quote, too long basked in a white world looking out of it, if at all, with white men's eyes and white perspective, unquote. The Kerner Commission recognized that the state of the media at that time was no longer good enough and that the, quote, painful process of readjustment that is required for the American news media must begin immediately, unquote. The Kerner Commission understood the need for diversity, and the need continues to this very day. I hope we have made progress in the employment of women and people of color in the media marketplace, but unfortunately, we don't have any data to understand employment demographic trends. That is because the FCC has failed to collect the data for nearly 20 years. This is extremely unfortunate. It's the reporters, producers, and executives that can influence programming decisions, which stories it covers, and importantly, how to cover a story. That's why this bill directs the FCC to finally, 15 plus years later, collect the data and that is statutorily mandated to do. This bill also requires the FCC to first finish the rulemaking it initiated over 15 years ago to determine its policies on whether the data should be publicly accessible. This bill addresses constitutional concerns by prohibiting the FCC from using the employment data to review license applications or assess compliance with the FCC's EEO rules. My bill also ensures that the data is analyzed and not simply reported. Finally, this bill creates a much-needed public searchable database regarding broadcast ownership data. Much like the employment diversity, ownership diversity can provide a window into the viewpoint diversity by identifying media outlets owned by women or people of color. We must stop paying lip service to the importance of employment diversity in the media industry, and I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
General Lady yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition for what
Mr. Chairman,
purpose?
Move to strike the last.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I've got some questions for counsel about the technical nature of this, and I certainly appreciate the goals of my friend, Ms. Clark, with this legislation. I'd like to get some clarification, though, of H.R. 5564's references to the FCC's EEO data collection. In 2001, the D.C. Circuit held that the FCC's EEO data collection was unconstitutional because it unlawfully pressured broadcasters to favor minorities in hiring processes. Now, in 2004, the Commission proposed reviving the EEO data collection by promising, and I'm quoting here directly from the 2004 NPRM reference in Section 2 of the bill, that it, and I quote, will not use the data in the reports to screen renewal applications or to assess compliance with our EEO regulations, close quote. Now, my understanding is the Commission believed this would safeguard against unconstitutionally pressuring broadcasters to adopt prohibited racial or gender preferences in hiring. So my question is whether reviving the EEO data collection today can be constitutional, because I'm concerned that we may risk subjecting the broadcast industry to potentially frivolous litigation. So counsel, under this Section 3 of the bill, the language prevents the Commission from using annual EEO reports in broadcaster license renewal proceedings or EEO compliance litigation. I'm trying to better understand the purpose of collecting this information, given the finding by the courts that this data led to unlawful discriminatory hiring practices. Would this language prohibit the Commission from using the data collected using Form 395B to review a transfer of a broadcast license?
Congressman, as you point out on page 2 of the AINS in paragraph C, the Commission is prohibited from using form data collected through Form 395A or 395B or any successor forms to review broadcast license applications or broadcast license renewal applications or to assess compliance with the equal employment opportunity rules of the Commission.
And so does that include transfers?
The language of the bill as written says to renew broadcast license applications and broadcast license renewal applications.
So not transfers.
Just the two I mentioned, broadcast license applications and renewal applications.
So if the bill were to be enacted into law, there's nothing in this text that would prevent the Commission from using the EO data collected to unlawfully pressure broadcasters to favor minorities in hiring processes?
Again, Congressman, the two prohibitions that are written out in the bill prohibit the Commission from using its data in both Form 395A and 395B to review broadcast license applications, broadcast license renewal applications, or to assess compliance with equal employment opportunity rules of the Commission.
So I'm going to take that as a general no. I've got another question. The D.C. Circuit in 2001 and the FCC in 2004 both recognized that the old annual reporting requirements created too great a risk of third-party litigation that would pressure broadcast licensees to unlawfully use race or gender-based hiring preferences. Today, under the FCC's existing rules and several robust voluntary industry initiatives, broadcasters and cable providers lead the way in their recruiting outreach to all qualified candidates. Counsel, does this bill exempt broadcasters who widely distribute job vacancy notices and already fulfill the FCC's EEO rules regarding recruiting initiatives from complying with this new EEO data reporting obligation?
I'm sorry, just to rephrase the
So
question
does this
so that I
bill
understand it.
exempt broadcasters who widely distribute job vacancy notices and who already fulfill the FCC's EEO rules regarding recruiting initiatives from complying with this new EEO data reporting obligation? Does it exempt them if they do those things?
There is no specific exemption of the type that you referred to in the
So
legislation.
then broadcasters that already fulfill the FCC's EEO rules are going to be subject to additional EEO regulatory requirements?
Congressman, the bill stipulates that the Commission, 1 year after the completion of the rulemaking required to be done 18 months after the enactment of the Act, the Commission shall begin collecting data using Form 395A and Form 395B. The bill doesn't specify beyond that what or how it might collect, only that it must collect.
My
Gentleman's
time's
time has expired. Who seeks recognition on the Democratic side? Ms. Sessions, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
To move to strike the last word.
You're
and
recognized
to-
for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I yield my time to Congresswoman Clark.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I understand that some of my colleagues seem to believe that the mere reporting of employment data is unconstitutional. No court has seriously questioned the constitutionality of collecting demographic employment data collection or invalidating the collection of that data on constitutional grounds. Instead, the courts have already held that the FCC cannot implement an EEO recruitment program that will pressure broadcasters into recruiting and hiring women and people of color. Nothing in the Communications Act or this bill requires the FCC to pressure broadcasters into recruiting and hiring women and people of color. Instead, the bill prohibits the FCC's use of the data to determine EEO compliance or deny license renewals. But demographic information is critical for the Commission to achieve its mission in other areas. Excuse me. For example, the FCC has an obligation to review its media ownership rules every 4 years. The Commission's most recent order was struck down by the Third Circuit, in part because the FCC failed to adequately consider the effect of the rule changes on female and minority ownership. As the FCC stated in the court, quote, No data on female ownership was available, unquote. This bill will require the commission to collect that data. It has been a long-held goal of the commission to promote diversity and localism in the media sector, and it is time that the FCC starts collecting the data to do so. With that, I yield back to the gentlelady.
Does the gentlelady yield back?
Yes.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Johnson, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, move to strike last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield whatever time he may need to our ranking member, Mr. Walden.
And I thank the gentleman from Ohio. And counsel, to the point Ms. Clark just raised on the ownership data, is it not true that the FCC already collects that kind of ownership data under the law?
Congressman, I think that's a question about what not a question about what's in the bill. What ownership data are you specifically referring to?
As to minority ownership of broadcast stations, licensees.
So
I
again,
believe that's already.
I would specify that this bill requires under law for the commission to collect 1 year after the conclusion of the 18-month further or fourth notice of proposed rulemaking to begin collecting data using FCC Form 395A and 395B or successor form.
Right, but now I'm going back in history here. When I was a licensee, it seems to me we had to file reports every year about ownership and who the owners of the company were. And I thought it included the very data that Ms. Clark, and we share that, there's no argument here, but I think that already happens. I think the industry, having been in it, it's one of the more regulated industries in the media marketplace already, and obviously under a lot of downward pressure to compete in the digital age. So it's important to increase diversity in employment and ownership. I fully agree with that in the broadcasting industry, but we also have to be careful not to enact policies that place unnecessary compliance burdens or potentially unconstitutional ones on the industry. So we're open to working with you to find a way to move this legislation forward to accomplish the goals that we share, and in trying to achieve more diversity in ownership and employment in the industry and especially in the broadcast industry. So we'd like to work with you, Ms. Clark, on that, go into full. I think this is a technical issue we could find a way through that would achieve the goal of your bill. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back to the gentleman from Ohio.
Does the gentleman yield back?
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there anyone on the Democratic side? Mr. Soto, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did locate an October 1st, 2017 report by the FCC, and it explains why we have to be so vigilant in this area. Women own 5.8% of Class A television stations, and looking downward, looking at commercial radio, 7.2%. When we look to racial minorities, we're looking at 2.4% ownership of Class A television stations, 2.9% commercial radio stations. And so what I believe Representative Clark is doing is trying to go further than just one report on this issue with a searchable database, but it also shows what a compelling state interest we have in looking at this area, since we're talking single-digit numbers.
Would the gentleman just yield? I have just a question on the report. Is that an ownership report?
That's correct, and I believe we're going beyond this with employment and the like.
Yeah, but and from what year was that?
2017.
Okay, and it does list the diversity data there?
The percentages for one report, but I believe Ms. Clark is, I reclaim my time. Ms. Clark is looking at an ownership database as well as other ways to make this easier for folks to report on. And with that, I want to yield to Representative Clark for any other comments she may have.
Thank you, my colleague. Let me just think, this is a rule that the FCC is not complied with. So why don't we just start from there? But collecting employment demographic data should not be controversial. This bill simply asks for broadcasters and MVPDs to provide data that will help us understand the media industry better. 50 years ago, the Kerner Commission found that the media's portrayal of people of color and race relations had intensified social discord. This was in part because of the overwhelming number of white men in control of media outlets. Times change, and hopefully things have improved. But without collecting demographic information, we cannot determine to what extent and for what reasons. I hope that there's bipartisan support for understanding the current demographic makeup of the media market so that we can have a discussion about diversity and localism that is informed by fact and not conjecture. With that, I yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
I thank Representative Clark for yielding back. And just to conclude, when we're looking at AM radio ownership, FM radio ownership, and television ownership of far less than 10% for women across America, and among minorities in many cases other than some of the low-powered television stations owning less than 10% of all stations, we know there's going to be an issue with employment and with ownership. And so there's definitely a compelling state interest for us to continue to look at both ownership in a more open and transparent way, and particularly to look at the employment too. And with that, I yield. Yes, I yield to
I thank the gentleman.
From California.
I'm just, in listening to this very important discussion, I've been on this subcommittee for 26 years. This is not the first time this issue has come up. Over and over and over and over again, there have been efforts to improve on the numbers. The numbers are constantly read into the record, how few minorities, how few women. I think the only way that we're really going to make some headway on this is that we make it a priority and we push forward and we stay on it. These things don't happen all by themselves. They have to be, it really has to come from the top of an organization, a top priority of the Congress. And I think that we really owe it to the people of our country. These are really shameful numbers. I mean, this is the second decade of the 21st century. It's not 1956. So I commend the gentlewoman for raising this and the legislation that she has, and I hope everyone will support it. It's an area that really needs to catch up with the times. I thank the gentleman and yield back to him.
I thank the gentlelady from California and would just close by saying, obviously, communications, radio stations, television stations are fundamental to First Amendment and to information for our citizenry. And so that diversity priority is something we can work together on to improve, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any member on the Republican side? For what purpose does Mr. Gianforte seek recognition?
I'd move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Oregon, the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Committee.
And I thank the gentleman from Montana. And I agree with the discussion here in terms of getting more diversity. That's why we're moved the amendment on the incubator program. We heard from witnesses before this very committee, if you want to do something to get more women into ownership and into broadcasting, if you want more minorities into ownership and broadcasting, they pleaded with us to move forward on the incubator program, which for some reason got stricken from the underlying bill we considered a few moments ago. I hope we'll work on finding a way forward in a bipartisan way on the incubator program, because we heard that would actually help. Second, when I think about the landscape of media, the broadcast business I left 13 years ago is much different today, and the media landscape's much different. And we should be talking about all those elements. I know certainly in Silicon Valley this is a big issue about diversity. And when you think about Facebook and Twitter and all, and the impact they have in providing information, this is something maybe we should be looking at in a broader lens than just in broadcast. It strikes me that this has been a big issue, and continues to be one in our country that we'll find common ground on this. I'm all on board. I just want to make sure we don't end up in a situation that sets us up for failure with a requirement that the next court goes, yeah, that one's unconstitutional too. And so that's all I'm trying to figure out here is how do you thread this needle and get it right? And so we look forward to working with Ms. Clark and others. We share this concern about increasing diversity, about increasing ownership, and moving forward in this space. It's long overdue. I yield back, gentleman from Montana.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Welsh seek recognition?
To address the...
Gentleman moves to strike the last word. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
No, I just want to thank Mr. Walden and Ms. Clark. This is about just getting information, so that's going to be really helpful and advance the reality of whether we're making progress or we aren't. So diversity, I think, is really beneficial. But you also make another point. Localism is really beneficial, and you come from that background. And these news deserts that we have, the loss of local media, especially radio, that is totally community-centered, in the agglomeration of media outlets, I think it's detrimental to the dialogue that we have to have in our communities. So I think the combination of Ms. Clark's gathering of information under this legislation, it lets us know whether there is diversity, and there isn't right now. So let's get the info. And then localism. And then the third prong is, what's the responsibility of these huge social media organizations where they basically are not at all monitoring some of the outrageous content that's on there and have none of the responsibilities that a local newspaper has. And it's profitable for them, but bad for our democracy. So I'm very pleased that Ms. Clark's legislation, because it's real and concrete, your commitment and experience with the importance of local news and local communication outlets, and then a big challenge for our committee is what are we going to do about the basically wildly free hand that the big social media platforms have to profiteer at the expense of our democratic values.
Would the gentleman yield? Just yes. On the point of localism, just from my own experience, I grew up in that era. I mean, back in even my father's day, we had mobile units in his Scout and in his Bronco, and we'd go out and cover accidents and fires and all that, and I did all that. When my wife and I bought the 2 radio stations in the next market over, they were pretty distressed. They had no wire service, no AP, no United Press International. They had a news guy that was kind of on his last legs. And by combining, we were able to restore, grouping up a little bigger. We actually started doing local sports. We started expanding the local news. And then we could share within the 2 communities. They're 20 miles apart, but they're kind of the same region. And now with the advent of this internet thing, right? So now you can transfer files back and forth, cover both towns, the whole region better because that. So I think we have to watch. There's a difference between sort of building up a big enough economic entity to actually do more as opposed to, sucking everything out. And so localism is the lifeblood of local broadcast and remains so because content's king. How you deliver it's really changing rapidly, and that's a challenge. And so I appreciate your comments and what Ms. Clark's trying to accomplish here as well. So I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition to speak on this amendment? Okay. Are there any members who seek recognition to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none, if there's no further discussion or amendments, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5564 will signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5564 is agreed to. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 5564 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 5564 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and H.R. 5564 as amended is forwarded to the full committee. And finally, last but certainly not least, The chair calls up H.R. 4855, the C-band Act. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4855, a bill to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to provide for an auction of C-band spectrum and for
Without objection, first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I want to once again thank my good friend, Ms. Matsui, as well as our colleagues, Mr. Johnson and Mr. Gianforte, for their support of this bill. We introduced this legislation because we all believed that this spectrum auction presents a golden opportunity to address some of our nation's most pressing communication needs. I remain committed to fixing the problems we have talked about in this subcommittee for more than a decade, such as rural broadband deployment, which I know my colleagues, Mr. Johnson and Mr. Gianforte, care deeply about, rural telehealth, public safety communications, next generation 911, digital opportunity and inclusion, and closing the digital divide. Because there are no other sources of revenue on the horizon to pay for these priorities, and as we have talked about time and time again, these are not problems the private sector has an incentive to do on their own. Capturing revenue from this auction remains our best chance at addressing these problems for the foreseeable future. Legislation also gives us the opportunity to equip the FCC with the legal authority it needs to conduct this auction without the uncertainty of using novel methods or treading through murky legal waters. As we heard at our hearing on the C-band, the threat of litigation and the threat of delay because of it remains high. Legislation also gives C-band dependent users such as broadcasters, cable providers, and public radio assurances that satellite providers will offer continuous service through the transition as well as after an auction occurs. These services rely on C-band satellites to distribute their content to hundreds of millions of Americans every moment of the day. Ensuring that mid-band spectrum gets to market is important and timely concern. This spectrum will be critical to the deployment of next-generation 5G services. However, it seems irresponsible that we would put the interest of 4 foreign satellite companies above those of the American people. And I, for one, have no interest in appeasing the interest of predatory private equity firms looking for a handout. This auction needs to work for all Americans. I'm happy that we're moving this legislation forward today and that we are continuing to work together towards a compromise. Are there members seeking recognition on the Republican side? Chair recognizes my ranking member, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today we're examining the Chairman's C-band Act, which, as the Chairman recognized, is a placeholder bill in an effort to move forward on legislation to capture revenue from a future C-band spectrum auction. When we had a C-band legislative hearing last year, I stated that in order to legislate the swath of spectrum for mobile terrestrial wireless service, we must consider the following: the technical steps necessary to protect incumbent programming services, how to get spectrum cleared as quickly as possible and make it available to the industry that will deploy it, how to ensure a fair and transparent process, and how to ensure that the U.S. maintains its leadership in 5G. These considerations still hold true today. I am pleased that the FCC has begun to take steps to proceed to auction the C-band spectrum by the end of this year, and we have to make sure that whatever legislation comes out of this committee does not delay that auction. We cannot wait to get this critical mid-band spectrum to market as our nation's wireless carriers are competing globally to secure U.S. leadership in 5G. I look forward to working with the Chairman to see if we can find agreement on a path forward on this important matter before we go to full committee markup. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I recognize my friend, the gentleman from Montana.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for yielding. I want to thank Chairman Doyle and Mr. Latta for their leadership on this. 5G will come to rural America if and only if different bands of frequencies are put to good use. And my understanding is that mid-band spectrum is particularly important for this purpose. The C-band provides the right mix of capacity and coverage that will enable network operations to deploy into rural America. I appreciate Chairman Pai's leadership in making the auction of the C-band public, which my bill required, and ensuring that these critical airwaves get to wireless providers as quickly as possible. I still believe this bill can be improved to capture some of the proceeds from this auction, which could be used for critical priorities, including expanding reliable broadband service to bridge the digital divide, particularly in rural America. I remain committed to working with Chairman Doyle and the rest of the committee to determine the best use of the auction proceeds and appreciate that our legislation was included in this markup. With that, I yield back to the gentleman for Ohio.
Would any other members on our side like to claim my time? Recognize my friend, the gentleman from southeastern Ohio.
Thank you for yielding, and I appreciate the time. You know, as I've stated before, the question is not whether this important mid-band spectrum should be repurposed, but what process the FCC should use to transition C-band spectrum from satellite to terrestrial wireless broadband use. We all agree that it's in America's best interest and vitally important that we win the race to 5G, and access to mid-band spectrum is an essential component of that. As a lead sponsor of the C-band Act, I commend the FCC on their decision to hold a public auction and their ongoing efforts with incumbent license holders on plans to relocate quickly and efficiently while also protecting C-band dependent users, as this legislation would also currently require. It's important that the FCC continue moving forward with their auction order and that they have the resources they need for a successful auction that empowers providers to deploy 5G networks. However, before rural America can benefit from 5G, we must continue working diligently to close the urban-rural digital divide. I strongly believe taxpayer resources should be used to meet the needs of American taxpayers first and foremost, and I am fully supportive of Congress and especially this committee working together to find a solution that would enable auction proceeds to be used for telecommunications priorities such as greater broadband deployment to rural areas. So I voice and echo my concerns and agreement with my colleagues. Everybody's pressing for that, and I yield back.
Thank you much, Mr. Chairman, and at this time I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition on the
Chairman.
Democratic? For what purpose does Ms. Matsui seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Since I introduced my Win 5G Act, I have believed legislation is necessary to address the C-band. By moving this bill forward today, we are maintaining an opportunity for a legislative vehicle that ensures important congressional priorities receive funding while providing stability for the auction. The proceeds from this auction can and should be used to support critical public safety infrastructure and expand rural broadband. Our window to act is closing, and I look forward to continuing discussions on this important bill as we head toward a full committee markup. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Walden, for what purpose? Okay. Anyone on the, Mr. Welch, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Well, I want to thank all the sponsors, and I'm a co-sponsor of this legislation.
Wish to strike the last word?
I'm sorry.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This may be the most important thing that we do for rural broadband. We've got a unity of interest here, whether you're a Republican or Democrat. If you represent rural America, you're not getting the broadband service that you need. This C-band auction is an opportunity to get funds that can pay for broadband build-out in rural America. I want to thank Chairman Pai for making the first decision that it's going to be a public auction. Number two, I want to thank the sponsors of this legislation for moving this forward. And then third, I want to address, Mr. Latta, the issue you raised, which I think is a good one. We don't want a delay. The delay is not going to come because Republicans or Democrats on this committee want to slow walk it. We're all united in our goal to get rural America wired and to not have discriminatory treatment between rural and urban America. There is a threat. It's hedge funds. And Mr. Chairman, I have an article that was in Barron's magazine that I'd like to make part of the record and pass out to my colleagues.
Without objection, so ordered.
But these four companies, number one, they're foreign. Number two, they didn't pay for the spectrum. They were essentially loaned the spectrum in order to do the satellite business. That's fine. But now they are putting the squeeze on taxpayers to pay them for something they don't own. It really boils down to that. And they got busted with folks on your side, Mr. Walden and our chairman and Ms. Matsui, who called out what it was. But now what you're seeing in the Barron's article is that a hedge fund, Appaloosa Capital, David Tepper, has made a bet. He's bought 7.4% interest in Intelstat. And his bet is that they can get the muscle to get the political and financial backing to essentially thwart the intent of this bill, which would be that the auction funds are dedicated to the public good. There are a couple of other hedge funds joining him in that effort. So the delay, if it's going to come, will be because three, I'm sure, very smart, very shrewd investors are making a bet that they can make money not by creating value, which is what we hope our good entrepreneurs do, but by denying opportunity to rural America. That's literally what it boils down to. And the question for this committee is, will we let David Tepper and these hedge fund folks get away with it? That's the question. We want rural broadband. We need it. We defend rural America, and it is getting left behind. And you know what? There's some folks out there, David Tepper, obviously one of them, he doesn't care. This is an opportunity for him. But we've got news for him and others. We do care. We care, and we're going to act to make certain that this public good, and thank you, Chairman Pai, for the public option, or the public auction, is going to be used for the benefit of rural America. I yield back. And I would like to pass out this Barron's article, which I hope all my colleagues read.
Yeah, without objection, so ordered. Is there anyone on the Republican side seeking recognition? Mr. Soto, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. This C-band spectrum auction, like many have said, is a tremendous opportunity. We've heard estimates of $13 to $14 billion can be generated to finally help bridge the rural broadband divide. Rural enclaves like Yeehaw Junction, Frostproof, Kenansville, and Florida's 9th Congressional District and other areas could be served well by getting the financial resources together to deploy in areas that otherwise may not be as economically viable for the private sector. I worry about students in my rural areas that have all their homework assignments online and have to do a lot of research online and don't have access to it, or the small businesses in our rural area who are trying to compete in a state, national, and international global business market and need access to the internet. I also think there's an opportunity as we go forward and raise this money from the auction. Another troubling trend is that we no longer have any domestic telecom production capacity here in the United States. There's some with our allies in Europe, but I believe as we go through with other bills in how we guide this rural broadband development, that we should consider using this also as an opportunity to boost a nascent and underwhelming domestic telecom production as we face issues from other countries that seek to spy on us. So hopefully that's another bill that the committee can consider as we go forward so that we could really kickstart American-made telecom technology again. And I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Seeing no one on the Republican side. Mr. O'Halloran, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll make it as brief as I can. As I watch TV these days, I see commercial after commercial after commercial on the speed of 5G. And it all has everything to do with urban areas. there's nothing mentioned of, and the speed at which this is going to occur for these types of areas. Then we take a look at rural America and tribal lands across America, and we see that there's nothing out there about 5G. In fact, the need for even catching up a little bit, this process is expanding the gap, it's not closing the gap. And that gap is so necessary for our ability to maintain the quality of life of people in rural America, the education of children in rural America, the ability for us to have medical services that provide, whether it's telemedicine or eventually surgery by remote doctors, to be able to address those issues. And I'm just perplexed on why we were even considering doing what now is not going to occur. But where this money goes is important. If this money just goes back in and doesn't reinvest it into the needs of rural America, we are doing the wrong thing. If this money just languishes out there and somebody finds another way to reinvest it in suburban and urban areas without the vision of what the people of rural America mean, it's where our food comes from, our water, our energy. You can go on and on. But it takes people to do all that. And those children out there need that education. Those people need health care in order to have them stay there in the first place. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to compete. And that, by them not being able to compete means that those families are going to have to move. Because like me and everybody else probably here, we want our children educated at the highest level possible. And that means getting this 5G process and this gap closed as soon as possible. And I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Seeing no one on the Republican side, Chair recognizes Ms. Clark. For what purpose do you seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield to you.
I thank the gentlelady. I would just note for the record that we are moving forward with a bill to authorize a C-band auction as a placeholder so that we may continue discussions regarding on how to authorize a C-band auction and use the proceeds of such auction for congressional spending priorities, among other things. But the bill before us today does not do that because it is, as I've just said, just a placeholder as we continue our negotiations. Any legislation that moves forward, however, will need to address those congressional spending priorities. Is that your understanding, Mr. Walden?
If the gentleman yield.
I yield.
Yeah, it is, Mr. Chairman. That's my understanding of the action we're taking today, and that we'll continue to work together between now and the full committee markup to see if we can come to an agreement. And while I'm glad you want to work together in this bipartisan agreement, and I know you are, we've met several times on this issue, I have to, again, express my frustration. We'd hoped to be able to be in this place last fall and could have been ahead of the FCC and their final decision going forward and really led on this. Look, 5G relies on making mid-band spectrum available to market as soon as possible. We all agree on this. Ms. Matsui was a leader on this years ago, trying to get us to this point. You know, we've been after this, and even upon returning the first part of this year, we reached out, our teams talked, and there were other priorities, obviously, on your side, but we kind of find ourselves here, and I'm worried about that timeline and how it slipped. But I do remain committed to working with you and your team to see if there is a legislative path forward. But as we have these conversations, we have to keep in mind the important goal is to ensure mid-band spectrum is made available as quickly as possible. My friend from Arizona, Mr. O'Halloran, summed it up well. I do recall when Mr. Ledger was here from T-Mobile, he made the case, because they have mid-band spectrum, that they did intend to build out in the rural areas. But you've got other companies that don't have that mid-band. That's what we're trying to get to here. We want a successful auction and as soon as possible, and we got to keep our eye on the ball to get that done. So short answer, yes, Mr. Chairman, look forward to working with you and your team going forward. Hopefully we can find the right place here. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back to me. I just want to thank the gentleman for continuing to work with us on this issue. We agree that we want to see, we're not trying to slow down the auction by any stretch of the imagination. And I believe the things that we're talking about are going to give some certainty to the FCC to make sure that doesn't happen. But I know the gentleman agrees with me, as do members on both sides of the aisle, that it's important that we get a win for the American people on this too. So I look forward to working with you as we go to full committee. And I thank the gentleman, and I yield back. If there's no further discussion on the amendment and the nature, or on the amendment, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. Yeah, so the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4855 to the full committee. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and H.R. 4855 is forwarded to the full committee. Okay, without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bills consistent with the actions taken by the committee today. The subcommittee now stands adjourned.